I still remember the excitement and anticipation felt earlier this year when talking to the guys from AMD about their upcoming Polaris GPUs. The anticipation only grew as we neared the launch, and so too did the hype. AMD made the announcement in early June that the RX 480 would cost us $200 and deliver R9 390-like performance. This bit of news had gamers seriously hyped, but unfortunately for many, this also created quite a bit of disappointment once the RX 480 landed later in the month. Upon release on the 29th of June, it was discovered that the RX 480s that everyone reviewed, myself included, were the 8GB models, which cost $240, not $200. There was still a $200 model, but it was the much less attractive 4GB card, though as I later discovered, the scenarios where the 8GB RX 480 is actually more capable than the 4GB model are few and far between. Even at $240, the 8GB RX 480 represents excellent value. Sadly, however, there have been a few issues. First and foremost has been availability. Getting your hands on an 8GB model for $240 has been next to impossible. In fact, for the most part, finding an RX 480 in stock anywhere has been a real challenge for most shoppers. For the longest time, the only RX 480s we could find were reference models, selling for $300 or more. AMD's custom board partner cards were nowhere to be found, even months after the initial release. Finally, we're starting to see custom RX 480s and availability is improving. Unfortunately, we aren't yet at the $240 MSRP, but things are slowly heading in the right direction. Giving me my first look at a custom design RX 480 is MSI with their gaming X88G. Armed with their latest generation Twin Frozer 6 cooler, this new graphics card looks much like any other high-end GPU from the current MSI lineup. This is a great looking cooler that performs as good as it looks. Although this card would be considerably cheaper than the MSI GTX 1070 Gaming X we looked at a few months ago, the cooler remains much the same. In fact, their RX 480 features the exact same cooler from the GTX 1060 model, so it's very capable. There are 3 heat pipes in total, 2 of which extend from one end of the heatsink to the other. Under the heatsink is a very large heat spreader that covers much of the PCB, providing cooling for the VRM circuitry and memory chips. Something you might have already noticed is that MSI has wisely upgraded the 6-pin PCIe power connector of the reference card to an 8-pin connector. This will reduce the amount of power that has to be drawn from the PCIe slot, and this means the graphics card is PCI Express compliant. On the back side of the graphics card, we find the same sexy backplate design that was featured on the GTX 1070. Around at the connectivity end of the graphics card, we find a DVI port, 2 HDMI ports, and 2 display ports. Typically, the RX 480 features 2 display ports, so this means one has been switched to HDMI. MSI has likely done this to make the RX 480 more VR friendly. The only other modifications MSI has made to their RX 480 affect the operating clock speeds. By default, the RX 480 operates at up to 1266 MHz, with a memory clock speed of 2000 MHz. MSI has left the memory alone, but they have pushed the core clock to 1330 MHz, a mild 5% factory overclock. With a little tinkering in AMD's Wattman, we were able to boost the core by another 30 MHz to 1360 MHz, which is a pretty meager 2% overclock. Meanwhile, the GDDR5 memory hit the ceiling at 2250 MHz, a more impressive 13% overclock. So with all that cleared up, let's get into the benchmarks. First up, we have The Witcher 3, and here the MSI RX 480 was 5% faster than the AMD reference card. This placed it alongside the GTX 1060 Founders Edition with an average of 44 FPS. This time in Far Cry, we see a 7% increase in performance, favouring the MSI card over AMD's reference model. As a result, the Gaming X was just a single frame slower than the 1060 Founders Edition. The MSI RX 480 managed to deliver an 8% boost over the reference card in Star Wars Battlefront, making it just 2 FPS slower than the GTX 1060. For whatever reason, The Division was a game where my AMD reference card really struggled, falling 3 FPS behind the R9 390. I suspect throttling was the issue here. Anyway, the MSI RX 480 was a massive 17% faster than the reference card, placing it 2 FPS ahead of the GTX 1060 and R9 390X. The MSI RX 480 was the more typical 7% faster in Mirror's Edge Catalyst when compared to the AMD reference card. This put it on par with the R9 390 and just a single frame behind the stock GTX 1060 Fe graphics card. Overwatch is another game where my reference RX 480 was seemingly underperforming. Our MSI card, on the other hand, provided 18% more performance, averaging 79 FPS, though this meant it was still 7% slower than the Founders Edition 1060. MSI are obviously feeding their RX 480 Gaming X model a lot more power as the total system power consumption increased by 12%. This took the system consumption to 282 watts, which is similar to what we saw from the i9 390 and Nano graphics cards. Despite consuming more power, the MSI RX 480 ran 10 degrees cooler than the reference card. Given the power consumption, I feel this is an excellent operating temperature for MSI's RX 480. Unfortunately, when it came time to overclock this card, we didn't have much luck. The core was increased by 30 MHz, a 2% overclock, and the memory by 250 MHz, a 13% overclock. This netted us 4% more performance in Overwatch, which hardly seems worth the trouble. It feels like I've been waiting so long, but I'm happy to have finally tested a high-quality board partner design RX 480. The Gaming X 8G model does a good job of showing the RX 480 in the best light possible, something AMD's own reference card didn't exactly do. From day one, I've said the AMD RX 480 reference card is pretty rubbish, and this just proves it. The tiny heatsink coupled with the inadequate 6-pin power input seem to provide inconsistent results in quite a few titles. Having found such strong performance in The Division and Overwatch with the MSI card, I went back and retested my reference card, only to find the same lackluster performance. The reference RX 480 was throttling in these titles, but not to the degree that would explain such a massive performance deficit between itself and the MSI card. Perhaps this has something to do with the power target, or there could simply just be an issue with my card. Either way, I was very pleased with the performance the MSI RX 480 delivered, and this has prompted me to put together an RX 480 versus GTX 1060 board partner card comparison. Expect a notification for that video in your inbox shortly. Overall, the MSI RX 480 Gaming X 8G is an excellent mid-range graphics card that delivers solid performance across the board. Thanks to the beefy Twin Frozer 6 cooler, it also looks very high-end, while also running cool and quiet. The only issue for now, and it's a rather large one, is the inflated price. Of course, poor RX 480 pricing isn't limited to MSI, but the Gaming X 8G is one of the pricier examples right now. Over in the States, it costs $340 US, and here in Australia, you can expect to pay at least $420, so not great given the $240 US MSRP. Still, I expect pricing to self-correct shortly, or rather, I hope it will. What do you guys think of the Gaming X 8G? Let me know in the comments. I'm your host Matt as always, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers guys for joining me for another episode of Hardware Unboxed. To those of you that already support the channel, thank you so much, it's truly appreciated, and to those of you that would like to support the channel directly, I do have Amazon links and a Patreon link in the video description below. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you guys next time.